Field combat on the Famicom. I thought this was on the NES, but no, apparently it's Famicom exclusive. This is a game that I became familiar with through the use of my many pirate multi-carts, and it's definitely an interesting one. It tries to combine the fast-paced action of a top-down, vertical-scrolling shooter, kinda, with the slow, methodical crushing of your enemies of an RTS. And like many games that I've seen that have tried to do this, it doesn't necessarily do it well, but it's always interesting to see what it tries to do. Now, the story is quite simple. You are the pilot of the Genesis, the newest, most powerful Sega console out there, trying to crush the Red Army of Nintendo and bring glory to the blue Sega fanboys around the world. Basically, though, it is an old arcade-style Famicom game. It's not going to be that story-heavy, and indeed really doesn't feature any story at all, but you do get an awesome UFO spaceship thing that is basically half shoot-'em-up machine, half UFO catcher. And that's what genuinely makes this game kind of fundamentally interesting. The main goal of the game is simple enough. You have to take your ship and cross the enemy's final defense line all the way at the top of the screen. But to do that, you have to get through your enemy's various units as well as any sort of physical obstacles in the world, because your spaceship is somehow hindered by terrain for reasons I can't quite understand. The controls themselves are very simple. You press A to shoot your opponents. You use the B button to fire up your UFO catcher tractor beam to absorb any enemies in your tiny little targeting reticle. Now that said, when you use this, you are completely stuck in place until you capture your opponents. And if your opponents are in the line of fire and not necessarily in the little targeting reticle, they don't get caught and will likely shoot you in the face. Which means utilizing this is actually kind of a tricky system because you are entirely vulnerable when you use it. So you're probably asking, why would you bother using it? Well, there's two reasons. First and foremost, you get more points, which, it being an arcade-style game, of course, is important. But more importantly than that, by capturing your opponents, you add them to your stock of units. See, like I said at the top, this is kind of also part RTS. If you press the B and A button at the same time, you summon units from your stock to come and assist you. And you've got a fair number of different individual units. You've got individual soldiers, you've got cars, you've got tanks, you've got what I think are supposed to be cannons. You even have a helicopter that seems to be largely useless because it just sort of flies around in weird random circles and doesn't really do much except explode. But still, it looks cool when it happens, so at the very least, you know, style points for being a distraction. And these units are really the key to victory, because ultimately they end up allowing you to both distract your opponents as well as thin them out, allowing you to make a simple, quick advance. And this is important because your ship doesn't have any extra health or anything. It's a very weak prototype super weapon that only takes one shot and then explodes. And it being very slow, kind of distracting and thinning out your opponents is really important. And that's part of the strategy of this game, because you could try and go in alone and try and make the advances that is necessary to beat any single level, but it's not that easy to do. You have to play a pretty solid dodging game, which is really hard in your slow, clunky UFO catcher. Whereas you could try and send your people out to distract them, but they're going to get shot down, they're going to have to be restocked, and you have to basically try and catch as many opponents as you can, which takes away from time that you could be trying to ultimately beat the level. There's a great dynamic of combat here that really makes the game pretty deep, even though it is a very simple game. Now that said, is it perfect? No. First of all, it is an arcade style game, so it is actually pretty difficult, and it is a very simplistic game. But one of the biggest issues I have with this game is simply the hardware that it's limited by. Like I said, you have to press A and B at the same time to summon your units, but you have no control over who you're summoning, really. In the lower right-hand corner, your units will cycle through in a pattern. I don't think it's random or anything, but you have no direct control over who you're summoning or when. It's really just what point you press the button. And if you're waiting for one specific unit, you're probably going to get shot in the meantime. And that's not good. Seriously, this game just needed the ability to just pause combat for just a sec and make your necessary decision. It really did need to take a step back and be a little bit more strategic rather than more arcadey. And adding a menu system and an ability to actually actively control who you're summoning would have made this game way easier, but also way better. Because ultimately this game does feel very, very simple. It's a complex game in its mechanics when you really boil it down, but at the same time, because of the limitations of the hardware and really the system it tried to employ for summoning your teammates, it does come across as overly simplistic, and it doesn't necessarily work all that great. Now, the overall presentation of field combat is okay. Your ship doesn't look too bad, and all the individual units look good, but they're not terribly detailed, and again, I've seen way better looking Famicom and NES games back in the day. And audio-wise, it's pretty underwhelming, but it's kind of what you expect from these kind of games. There's a title screen song, and then there's one song for gameplay, and that's your lot. Although I will give credit, the main combat theme is a modified version of Ride of the Valkyries, which is kind of awesome. But the overall presentation is, at best, just sort of average for what this is. Now, if you want a copy of Field Combat, cheapest one I'm seeing right now is $2 plus shipping. Now that shipping would bring it up to like $7, which makes it a little pricey for what you're getting. But if you're already making an order from an importer online and it's basically free shipping to add it, you know, Field Combat might not be a bad little game to add to your cart. Because there are a few games I can think of off the top of my head that tried to be RTS's meet shmup. And while I'm not necessarily sure any of them did it particularly well, again, consoles don't necessarily like the concept of RTS in general, especially this early on, that's still impressive to try and bring it to the Famicom, and while I don't think any of them have done it necessarily all that particularly well, it's always fascinating to see how they try and change it and how they try and make their game more unique and how they try and wrestle with the challenge of making a fast-paced shooter tied to a slow, methodical strategy game. And if nothing else, this game is very impressive and a fascinating little import you could add to your Famicom library. Is it a great game? Not really, but it's interesting and it was a fun little pickup for what it was. Just maybe don't spend too much on it.